React is the most popular front-end framework out there, and there are tons of jobs looking for good React developers, but learning React and becoming a good React developer is incredibly difficult. That's why I'm creating this video. Whether you're an absolute beginner at React or if you've tried to learn React and it's never really stuck with you, this video is perfect because it's going to introduce you to all of the basic concepts of React and give you a really good foundation for learning the rest of React. That's because in this video, I'm going to be covering things like what React is, how to think like a React developer, components, props, state, useEffect, and much more. This is the perfect video if you're just getting started or if you really want to make sure you master the basics of React. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And in this video, I'm going to be breaking it down into a few different sections, and I'm also going to be putting timestamps down in the description so you can skip around if you want. This very first section is just going to be what React is. The next section is how to think like a React developer, which is by far the most important section. Make sure you don't skip that. And then finally, at the end, I'm going to be using a project to demonstrate all the different concepts of React that I think are important to understand if you're just getting started. Now, very first, I want to talk about what React is. On the homepage, you can see it says it's the library for web and native user interfaces. And essentially all React is something called a front-end framework, which just allows you to build out front-end based applications with some more ease and some more features on top of normal JavaScript. So if we scroll down here, you can kind of see an example of what some React code will look like. You can see that we have stuff that looks like HTML. It's called JSX. I'll talk about it more in a little bit. But essentially, this is how you define things inside of React. And you'll notice you have normal things like an anchor tag, a div, and h3. And you also have things called custom components, like a thumbnail or a like button. And you'll notice when I hover over these things on the left, on the right-hand side, it's actually showing what this corresponds to inside of the actual HTML rendered version. So the whole idea of React and most other front-end frameworks is to break up your code into these different components, like a thumbnail component, a video component, a like button component, and then you combine those different components together to create your application. It's a different way of thinking about programming, and it makes writing larger applications much easier. And you can see, if we can scroll down, you can see this right here, write your component with code and markup. And you'll notice it looks just like HTML, but with a few extra things thrown in. And that's what that JSX is for. And again, I'm going to be talking about this in more depth. You notice you can add in different interactivity. For example, we have like some on-change events and so on that are happening here. So when I actually change my search, you can see that it's actually filtering what I have down here in this bottom list. And that's really all you need to know about what React is. It's just a tool that makes writing front-end applications easier by going through and doing a lot of the hard work for you of making sure everything syncs up properly, and you can just write your code in a much easier to understand way. Now, with that out of the way, I want to actually talk about how you think about React code and how you think in React, because it's quite a bit different than what you do with JavaScript. So here they have a page in the documentation that explains this a little bit, but I'm going to go in even more depth because I think it's really important. So the main thing that when you're writing out your React code, you want to think about what the final version of your application is going to look like. So here you can see that we have what our UI is going to look like, and then you want to break that down into components. That's the first step they recommend. So you're saying break this UI into components, and you notice that they have each section kind of highlighted. So we have like this search bar section. We have a table with all of our products. We have the actual category rows, each row for our product, and so on. So it's breaking down this large overall UI that we have here into a much more concrete different pieces that we can break apart, as you can see here, and we can create those components inside of React. So the first step and the most important step is to think about your application as the final product. What do you want the final product to look like? Then break that final product down into different pieces, as you can see that they've done here. Then you can take those pieces and actually turn them into components inside your application, which I'll show you how to do in the last part of this video where I go over a project-based example. But the real key with when you're breaking apart all your different things into components is when you go to actually write your code for the components and how everything works, you need to rewire how you actually think about writing your different programs. Because inside of a normal, JavaScript-based application, you're going to be writing what's called imperative code. That means your code goes step by step from the top down to the bottom. You're saying, do this, then do this, then do this, then do this. You're just telling your code what to do, a list of instructions. React is different because instead of saying do this, then do this, then do this, you're saying I want this to look like this in the end. Essentially, you're saying I want my UI to look like this, and you just fill everything in for me. It's called declarative programming. The best way I can think of as an analogy to write this out is if you wanted to make a sandwich, for example. One way you could make a sandwich is get a list of ingredients, and then you could have a list of instructions step by step on how to make a sandwich. So you could say, like get the bread, then you could say put the meat on the bread, put the vegetables on the bread, put the sauce on the bread, and now you have a sandwich. The other option of creating a sandwich would be going to a sandwich shop and just saying, give me a sandwich. These are the two different approaches. The first one where you had a recipe with instructions, that's the imperative approach. That's like how normal JavaScript code is written. The second approach, where you actually had sandwich shop and you just went there and you said, give me a sandwich, that is the declarative approach, because you're saying, I want this specific thing, give it to me. So imperative is saying, here's how you get to the end result, and declarative is saying what you want. So instead of saying how to get there, you just say what you want. And that's the big mindset shift that you need to have when it comes to writing React code. And again, in the project at the end of this video, I'm going to show you exactly what I'm talking about in that declarative mindset you need to have. That's the biggest shift you need to take when you're going from JavaScript code to React code. Otherwise, all of your normal JavaScript concepts you learned apply perfectly to React. Now, if you want to really master that React way of thinking, I actually have a full React course called React Simplified, and the real purpose of this course is to change your mindset to that React way of thinking, that declarative mindset. It's very difficult to go from a JavaScript way of thinking to a React way of thinking, so this course is specifically meant to do that for you. So if you're interested in this, I'm going to leave a link down in the description, and for just the next couple days, I'm actually running a sale on it. It's the lowest price it'll ever be, so if you're watching this video right when it comes out, I highly recommend checking that out to get that lowest price possible. Now, with all that out of the way, let's just close out of this and we can see what the final version of our application looks like. That's going to be on the right hand side here. You can see I can enter in a new item that I want to do. Like, let's say I just want to do the laundry as my to-do item. I can click add. You can see it's been added to the list. I can check it as completed, and I can even delete it from the list. And if I just come in here and I just say do laundry again, add that in, check it off, and refresh, you notice my data is actually persisting through, and I can add in something else to the list, and you can see that that is showing up as well. So this is what the final version of our product is going to look like, and it's going to cover tons of different things like components, state, useEffect, other different hooks, and so on. So this is going to cover all those things that you need to know about React, all of those basic and even some intermediate concepts. So to get started creating a React application, the best thing to do is just open up your console, and what you want to do is you want to run npm create vite at latest, and then just hit enter, and that's going to create a Vite application. First, you want to tell it the project name. If you put period, it's just going to create it in whatever folder you're currently in. That's what I want to do. And then you need to scroll down here where it says React, just use the arrow keys. And we want to use JavaScript or JavaScript with SWC. The SWC is just going to be slightly faster, but if it doesn't work, just choose normal JavaScript. It'll work just fine. Now we can run npm I to install all of our dependencies, and then we can run npm run dev to actually get our application started. So we can just run that real quick. That's going to start up our application, and if we open that up, you can see here is the final version of our application. This is just what's randomly generated, and it just has a really simple counter right here, pretty straightforward. Now, if at any point you had issues where like npm wasn't defined, you just need to make sure you install Node.js. So just go and search Node.js download that, and then npm should work just fine for you. So once you have this done, you're going to notice you have some files on the left-hand side. A lot of things are generated for you. You have a config file for defining any of your Vite configurations that you need. You can ignore this. Package.json, you can ignore this as well. Same with this lock file. This index.html is really important because you notice this is where our script tag is being imported. And if we look inside of our source, we have this main.jsx. And all that this is doing is it's hooking up our index.html with our React code. Because inside of React, your HTML is actually completely empty. All we have is a single div called root. And if we look inside of our JSX here, which is our JavaScript code for React, that's what JSX is standing for essentially, you can see here that we're getting that root element and we're rendering our application inside of it, which is just this app component right here. So the important thing to understand about this main.jsx and this index.html is they are just hooking each other up to one another. So that way, everything inside your application is going to render inside this root div right here. And as you can see, if we inspect our page and we look at the elements, you can see that this root has all of our application inside of it, just like we expect. Now, the next important thing to understand is the idea of components. If we look at our app.jsx, you can see we have a function, and that function is being exported. A function inside of React, as long as it starts with a capital letter, is essentially just a component, because you'll see down here we're returning what looks like HTML, but again, this is called JSX. I'm going to cover more exactly what the differences are. But if you're returning JSX from a function that starts with a capital letter, that is called a component. And a component, like we talked about, is for breaking down the individual parts of your application. So in our application, you can see here that we have our to-do items. Those could be a component. We have a list of items. That could be another component. We have this form up here at the top. That could be another component. And you can break things down as granularly or as non-granularly as you want. To get started, we're just going to put everything inside of one component, and then we're going to break it up as we see fit based on what the actual particular needs of our application are. When you're getting started, that's generally the easiest way to go. You'll also notice we have a few other files like some CSS files and some asset files. I'm going to be deleting pretty much everything, so this assets we're going to get rid of. We don't need this public folder. Same with the CSS, we're going to get rid of that. Inside here, we're going to remove the import for our CSS. So that way we can see mostly everything's working. And in here, I'm just going to get rid of everything. I'm just going to say that we have a function called app, which we're going to export as a default, which is just going to return the text hi. So now you can see we just have the text hi being returned, super straightforward. Now the last thing that I want to do before we actually get started is I have some CSS that I'm just going to bring in. I'm just going to copy paste it into the source folder. If you want to use this exact CSS, it's actually going to be linked in the GitHub repository in the description down below, so you can get this exact CSS, but it's rather complex. It has nothing to do with React. So I'm just going to be bringing it in right here, and then we can import that anywhere we want. So we can just say import./styles.css. And if you're unfamiliar with this import syntax or this export syntax, I have a full video covering it. It's actually a JavaScript concept. I'll link it in the cards and the description for you. So there we go. You can see we have some things that have changed for our styles to support the styles that we have in our style sheet. Next, what I want to do is I actually want to create these different elements that we have here for our different form elements. So let's do our form first here. And what we can do is we can just come in here and I want to return a form element because this is going to be a form. And inside of here, I want to just render out all of the essentially HTML for this. And you'll notice this JSX will look almost identical to HTML. So for our form, we're going to want to give it a class. And normally you would just say class, and then you would give it whatever class you want. In our case, new item form. But inside of React, class is actually a reserved keyword because you can create, a class like this. So what we need to do is we need to call this class name instead. So anytime you have a JavaScript keyword like class or for, you need to replace it with class name or HTML for and so on. And I'm going to show you all those instances in this video. But if you want to define a class name on something, you need to use class name instead of class. And that right there is going to give us the class styling for our form. So let's put our elements inside of here. For example, we're going to have a row. So I want to say class name is form row. And inside of here, I'm going to have a label. And this label is just going to say new item. And then I'm going to have an input for that new item label. So we're just going to say type is text. ID is going to be item. There we go. And let's just close that off. And then our label, we want to link up our label on our input. Normally you use a for that. In our case, we're going to be using HTML for, just because it's JSX and not HTML. Now with that done, if we come over here, you can see we have this, and when I click my label, it properly highlights inside of my input, so we know that this HTML4 is working properly. The next thing I want to do is just add in our button. So we're going to add a button, which is going to have a class of button added onto it, and it's just going to say add. So now we have our form, and you can see it looks identical to the form in our other example, which is exactly what we want. Now the next thing I want to do is add this header right here. So we can just come in here with an H1, and this is going to say to do list, and I'm also going to give this a class name of header. And if I save, you're going to notice it's actually giving us some errors. And that's because one really important thing to know about components inside of React is you can only ever return one element. You'll notice here we're returning two elements. We're returning a form and we're returning an H1. And at the top level, you can only ever return one element. There's a few ways to get around this. You could just wrap everything inside of a div, and that will technically work. If I just bring this down here, you're going to notice now everything works, but we have this extra div wrapping everything. So instead you can use a fragment. A fragment is just an element that has no tag at all inside of it. So you can see that this is just an opening and a closing angle bracket, and here we have the exact same thing, but this one is just got the slash in the middle. And now if we save, we get the exact same result, but now we no longer have that extra div wrapping everything. So if you want to return multiple elements from a component, you need to use a fragment, and a fragment is just essentially an empty tag. So now we can finally get to the point of rendering out our list. So we can come in here, we want to have a UL, which is going to have a class here of list, close that off. And then inside of here, we're going to have a few different LIs. And inside the LI, I want to have a few things. First of all, I want to have a label. And inside this label, I'm going to have an input. And this one is going to be a checkbox. So we're going to say type is checkbox. And we're just going to close that off. And inside of our label, we could just put whatever we want, like item 1, for example. And then finally, we can add a button. And this button is going to be our delete button. So let's make sure we give it proper classes. That's just going to be danger. There we go. This is just going to say delete. So now if we save, you can see we have item 1 here. And if I copy this down one more time, item 2, you can see item 2 is showing up, and I can check mark them and everything is linking up perfectly. So up until this point, all we've really done is we've converted what we want the final version of our application to look like into something called JSX, which as you can see looks almost identical to HTML. There's just a few really minor differences like class name, HTML4, and this empty fragment tag. Also, you notice our entire page is essentially static. Nothing at all can change. And obviously we want to be able to add new items when I click add instead of just having it, clear out and refresh the page. So that's going to be the thing that we work on next, but I want to very first make sure that we understand what this is. This is almost like that declarative approach. I'm declaring I want my site to look like this, and I wrote out all the JSX for what I want it to look like. And now when I start adding interactivity into my site, instead of saying, okay, I want to manually change this value, and then I want to do this, and then I want to do this, instead, you're going to be changing this JSX and just saying, I want this value to always be equal to this specific variable, and so on. You're just saying, this is the value of what this thing is. Again, you're declaring what your output is going to look like, and React does all the magic behind the scenes for you to make sure it hooks everything up. So in order to actually be able to modify variables and have things interactive, you need to use something called state. So what we can do is we can come into here and we can say use state. This is a hook inside of React. We can just import this from React up here at the very top, and use state essentially takes a default value. By default, we're going to give this an empty string. So we're going to hook it up to our input right here. And by default, our value is just an empty string. This is going to return to us two things. So it's going to return to us an array of two different values, with the very first value inside of this array just going to be whatever the value of our thing is. We'll call it new item. And the second value inside this array is going to be a function, for updating our value. So we can say set new item. And this is a very common naming syntax. You'll see the first name is called whatever, and the second value is just going to have set in front of the name because it is a function. And now if you're very unfamiliar with the syntax of destructuring, I have a full video covering this as well. I'll link it in the cards and description. This is a JavaScript concept, not a React concept. So now we need to talk a bit about what state is, because it's kind of the magic behind how React works so well. So like I said, I have this function right here that allows me to update my state. Normally you would just say like new item equals whatever your new value is going to be. You know, I could just say this is my new item value. But inside of React, you cannot update a state variable like that. If you're using state, you are not allowed to change the value of your state because this is immutable, which means it cannot change. Technically, it won't throw any errors, but this will not work like you expect it to. You'll even see here, it's actually throwing me an error. It's saying that I can't redefine this because it's declared with a const, so already that's helping me a lot. Now instead, if I want to change my value, I need to call the function set new item, and I need to pass it my value like this. And what this is going to do is it's going to update my new item value to be this value right here. But to do that, it's actually going to re-render my entire component. If I actually save this, it's going to cause an infinite loop. You're going to notice nothing's working. It's causing an infinite loop, which is why that's not working. And that's because what happens is it renders my component. We'll just comment this out for now. It renders out your component, and it comes down, it renders out all of this JSX right here. It converts it to HTML and puts it on the page. We've already seen that happen so far. When I call set new item, what that's doing is it's saying, okay, I want you to update my new item variable to this new value and then rerun my entire component with that new value. So when I call this, it's going to run this entire application over again. It's got my new item value set to this, and then it's going to render all of this JSX down here, convert it over to HTML. But the problem is I have set new item right here, so every time my component reruns, it's calling this function again, which tells my component to rerun, and over and over again, causing an infinite loop. This is a really common problem a lot of people run into. So what we want to do is we want to update our input when it changes. So we can come in here, we can say the value of our input is just equal to whatever our new item variable is. Super straightforward. So now whatever this is, if we give it a default value, you can see it gets put right here inside of that new item section. And it doesn't matter what this is, it's going to be updated right there. Now, obviously, we just want to leave this blank to get started, and we want to update it whenever our item changes. So inside of React, if you want to handle different event listeners, you can just come in here, you can say on, and then whatever the event listener is. So in our case, we have an on change event. And the on change event in React actually works a little different than it does inside of normal JavaScript, because normally on change only fires on blur, or like when you stop changing something. Normally, you would need to use on input if you want something to happen every single time you change the value in the input. But on change in React is changed so that every single time I click a key, it's going to call on change right here. So this is going to take in an event object. And what we can do is we can call set new item with our event.target.value. So what this is doing is just getting the value of my input. It's setting it as my new item value, and it's putting it right there. So now if I refresh and I type, you notice my input is working just like it did before. If, for example, I remove this on change and I try this and I refresh, you're going to notice I'm typing, but nothing at all is happening. And that's because my value is set to be new item, which is an empty string. So I'm declaring that my input always has a value of empty string, but I'm never updating it, so it's never getting changed. Here, I'm saying whenever I change my input, get the new value of my input, set that as my new item, rerun my component, and now the value here is set to my new item value, which is whatever I have typed into my input. This is again something that trips up a lot of people, but what you need to understand about what you return from your component, you're just returning the exact output of what something is going to look like. So if your value is set to a specific value, the input is always going to have that value no matter what happens. And the only way to update that value is by changing it somehow by calling, set new item and changing that state variable. And also when you change a state variable, the important thing to note is that it always re-renders your entire component. So that way, if you have any changes, so like when this new item changes, when it updates this value, it's going to make sure it updates everywhere that's used inside of your component. So now with this done, we at least have our input working, but when I click add, it's not doing anything at all. So let's go ahead and work on that next. So we want to be able to have some type of event listener on our form. So we're going to use the onSubmit event listener, and we're just going to call a function. I'm going to come up here, I'm going to create a brand new function called handle submit, just like this. And I can just say e.prevent default. That's going to prevent my page from refreshing. So now when I click add, you're going to notice it just does nothing at all, which is great. What I want to do is I want to create a brand new to-do and add it to our list. So to do that, I'm going to create another piece of state. We're going to call it to-dos and set to-dos. We're going to set that equal to useState. And by default, we're going to have an empty array for our to-dos. And again, any type of data that you want to have re-render your component when it changes. So when we change our input or when we change our to-dos, we obviously want to re-render our application to make those new changes take effect. You want to put those inside of state. So we're putting this inside of state here. So now I can say that I want to set my to-dos. And normally the way I would set my to-dos is I would just come in here, I would get my to-dos, and I know that I can't modify this variable. So I'm just going to spread it out, and that's going to give me a brand new array. And I can just add a new value onto the end of it like this. And this would work. Let's come in here, give it an ID, crypto.randomuuid. We're going to say the title is just going to be new item, and completed is going to be false. This technically works. And if I come in here and I just do a quick console.log of our to-dos, I inspect our page, go to the console, you can see it starts out as an empty array. And if I click add, you can see it's adding a brand new to-do to the end of that list, as you can see here. But this is not how you're supposed to do this inside of React. Because let's say I copy this down. This should now technically add 2 to-dos, but it doesn't. So let's check this again. I'm going to type a bunch. I'm going to click add. I'm going to refresh, or I'm going to inspect my page, and you'll notice we still only have 1 to-do, not 2 to-dos being added. And that's because with the way that setting state works inside of React is this value to-dos is always equal to whatever we rendered on our last render, which by default is an empty array. So to-dos is an empty array. When I call set to-dos, it's taking an empty array and adding 1 value to the end of it. When I call it a second time, this to-dos value is still an empty array, so it takes an empty array and adds a new value to the end of it. So technically, this first one never even matters at all because this second one is overriding everything that this first set to-dos does. So if you want to be able to modify the existing data, you need to actually pass a function to your set state here, your set to-dos. And this function is just going to return whatever value you want the new state to be. And the important thing is it actually takes one argument, which is the current value for whatever your state is. So here, I can just copy all this code that I have right here, put it inside my return, but instead of using my to-dos that's defined up here, I can use this current to-dos right here. And now it's going to make sure that if I do this twice, it'll actually add 2 values to my array instead of 1. So let me just show you that in action real quick. We'll refresh, hit add, and now if I inspect my page, go to the console, you'll notice our array now has 2 values instead of 1, because the first time we run our set to-dos, our current to-dos is equal to an empty array, and it adds 1 value to the end. And the second time, our current to-dos is equal to the return value from here, so it has 1 value in it already, and then it adds a second value to the end. Now, obviously, we only want to add 1 value, so we're going to remove this second add, but I wanted to put that there just to show you the difference between using a set new item like here, where we pass it a value, versus passing it a function, because it's really important. Anytime you need to use the current value, you want to make sure you pass a function. Otherwise, you can just pass a value like this. So now we actually have all of our to-dos. They're being stored inside this array. So instead of hard coding our to-dos down here, let's actually loop through the to-dos and render them out. To do that inside of React, we need to use a map. So we can say todos.map. And you notice that I have this interesting curly bracket syntax right here. Anytime you put something inside of curly brackets, what it's going to do is it's going to run it as JavaScript code, and whatever it returns, it's going to place right inside of here. So here, this todos.map is just going to return an array, and an array gets rendered out to JSX just like as if it was elements one after the other. So for each one of our to-dos, what I want to do is I want to return an li element. I essentially want to return all of this code right here. So let's just paste that in there and remove all of this right here. And what I want to do is I want to get my to-do dot title and place it right there. And for our checkbox, I can set my checked property equal to to-do dot completed. There we go. So now if I give that a quick save, you're gonna notice it's rendering out those two items. If I refresh, I just say to do 1, and then I say to do 2 and 3. You can see it's adding all those different items to the page right here, which is exactly what I want. But you'll notice something interesting. If I inspect my page, go to the console, we're getting a bunch of errors. Each child in a list should have a unique key prop. So if you're returning an array of elements inside of React, which as you can see, I'm returning an array of elements right here with this map, you need to make sure each element at the very top level has a key property. So I can say key equals, and this must be a unique identifier. So we have our to-do.id, which is unique to each one of our to-dos. The reason you need to do this inside of React is because let's say I wanted to edit or delete or modify one of the to-dos in my list, but I didn't want to change any of the other ones. I just wanted to change one. Well, React needs to know which one changed. So it uses this key to know which to-do is changing. So if we should change the to-do with the ID of 7, it knows, okay, whenever I change the to-do with the ID of 7, update the information for this particular element and don't bother with touching any of the other elements. It's a performance optimization, which makes it so your code can run faster and better, and it's going to make sure that no weird bugs come up. So it's really important you always remember to put a key, which is some type of unique identifier. And generally, it's bad idea to use the index of the element in the array because if I delete elements in the array, it could really mess up different things. So now we actually have our to-dos showing up in the list. And one thing I want to do before we go any further is up here, I just want to set my new item to an empty array. So that way, if I just type in something, click add, you can see it clears out what I had before. Just makes it a little bit easier to add more and more to-dos. But now I want to make it so when I try to toggle the checkbox or delete them, it actually does what I expect. So here, whenever I click on my input right here, I actually want to do something. So I can say on change, and what I can do is take in my event, and I want to call a function, we're going to call it toggle to do. And this is going to take in my ID as well as the e.target.check to determine if it is currently checked or not. So let's create that function all the way up here. Function toggle to do, which takes in an ID and whether or not it's completed. And I want to update my to-dos to change the ID of the to-do I pass in here to be completed based on this flag right here. So I can say set to-dos. I know that I want to use the current to-dos, so I'm going to use a function version here. And what I want to do is I want to map through these. So I want to say current to-dos.map through each one of our to-dos. And for each one, I want to check to see if it's the one that I'm currently trying to toggle. So if my to-do.id is equal to the current ID, then I know it's the one I want to change. And what I can do is I can just return my to-do spread out so I get a brand new object and I just change the completed property to this completed property here. And again, this is really important. Anytime that you're dealing with state, you cannot change it. So you would think normally I would just say like to-do.completed is equal to completed, just like that, and ignore this right here. But that's mutating my state. It's immutable, which means you cannot change it. And if you change it like this, it's not going to work properly. You need to make sure that anytime you're changing your state, you need to make sure that you're not actually mutating it, and instead you're creating a brand new state object. So here we're creating a brand new to-do and just changing one property on it. Now, also I need to make sure I just return my to-do, because if it's not matching the current ID, I just want to return it as is with no changes at all. So now you can see when I click, it's actually properly toggling between my different to-dos. And the way that's working is I have this on change click event listener right here. So whenever I change my to-do from non-checked to checked, it's going to call this. It's going to call the toggle to do function for my particular ID, and it's going to pass along whether or not it's checked. And then here I'm just checking which to-do I want to change, and I'm making sure I return a new updated version of that. I can essentially do the exact same thing for delete by just saying delete to-do. This just needs to take in an ID. I want to set my to-dos just like this. And what I want to do is I want to use all my current to-dos, just like I was doing before. Now I want to take my current to-dos and I want to filter them. So I want to get a filtered version that includes all my to-dos except for the one I want to remove. So here, I just want to say if my to-do ID is not equal to this ID, then I want to keep it, otherwise remove it. So now I can come down here on my delete button. I can put an on-click event listener, just like all the other event listeners. Starts with on and then whatever we want to do. And here I can just say, I want to call delete to do and pass it in my to-do.id, just like that. Now if I save, click delete, you can see it's deleting these just like I expect them to. Now one giant problem that people run into is they actually write their code like this instead. They remove the actual function arrow right here. You'll notice the difference is this is passing a function, and this right here is passing the result of calling delete to do. this is not going to work. You can see if I add my to-do, it's actually automatically deleting itself right away. The reason for that is because it's actually calling delete to do and then passing the result of that as my click event listener. Instead, I want to have a function that I actually call for on click. So here I'm passing a function that calls delete to do. So when I click on my button, it's going to call this function, which is going to delete my to do. So it's really important that you make sure that you almost always are going to be passing a function like this, just to make sure it's always going to work like you expect. Because if you pass like this, you can see it's calling this function right away and then passing the return value of that function to onClick, which is definitely not what we want. This will actually work like we expect it to though. Now another thing I want to do is when we have no to-dos, I just want to render that out to the screen just saying we have none. So we can say to-dos.length is equal to 0. And we want to check to see if this is true to do something. Well, inside of React, the best way to do that is with short circuiting. So we can put double ampersand here, and then whatever we want to return, which in our case is no to-dos. Now you can see it's saying no to-dos whenever this is true, but if it's not true, you can see it doesn't render this at all. And this is something called short circuiting. I have a full video covering it. It's a JavaScript concept. I'll link it in the cards and description for you. Now I know we've covered a lot of concepts about React, but essentially you have an entire to-do list up and running now, which is great. But what I want to do is I actually want to break this apart into different components, because right now all of our code is in one file and it's not too hard to follow because it's a relatively simple application. But as it grows and gets larger and larger, this becomes difficult to maintain and we need to break it up into different components. So the very first component that I see right here is this form at the top. This is obviously separate from everything else in our application, so we can break it into its own component. So what we can do is we can just come in here, we can say new to-do form.jsx. Whenever you are going to be creating a component, it must end in .jsx. And we just want to export a function called new to-do form, just like that. And then what we can do is we can just copy all of the HTML or JSX that we have inside of here, and we're going to return it from this function instead. Now, obviously, we need to hook up things like our handle submit and so on. So let's copy over the handle submit function, just like this. We're going to bring that into here. And now also you're going to notice we need to access our set to-dos as well as our new to-do item. So we can bring in our state for our new to-do item. Let's bring that over into here. Make sure that we import use state properly. There we go. So now our new item and our set new item is properly hooked up inside of here. So all of that's working. The only thing that we have left to get working is to be able to actually update our to-do. I'm just going to comment that out for now though. So if we do that, we can come into here, we can give this quick save, and you're going to notice our form has been removed. To add that in, we just need to import that component. So what we can do is we can just type in new to-do form and bring in that component right here. And it's just importing that component from that file, and then we're just rendering that out as if it was normal HTML. So if it starts with a capital letter, React is smart enough to know that this is a custom component that you've created. So it's trying to render out this component, which is running all of this code and then returning our value down here. Now you're going to notice everything is working except for the fact that we can't actually add our to-do yet. This code right here needs to live inside of our app because this is where our to-do state lives. And we can't move our to-do state into this form because we also need it for our list right here. So the to-do state has to be here. We need a way to update that state. Well, we can create a simple function. I'm going to say function add to-do. There we go. I'm going to paste the code into here. And this is essentially what our add to-do function is going to look like. We're just going to be passing in the title we want to add for our new to-do. And that goes right there. So now we have a way to add our to-dos. We just need to pass that function down to our new to-do form. So we can call it right here. And we can, add to-do, and pass it in our new item. Also, we should probably check to see if our new item is equal to an empty string and return, because obviously we want it to have some type of value. So how do we get this add to do into this component? This is where the idea of props come in. Props allow you to pass information down to custom components. So you'll see here we can set things like class name, checked, on change, and so on. These are props that you can pass to HTML elements. But you can do the same thing for custom components. So I can say I want to pass down a prop called add to do. And we'll just give it the add to do function. And I can call this whatever I want. Let's just say I call this on submit is what I call this. And we're going to pass down the add to do function. So we're saying there's a prop on our new to do form called on submit, and we're passing it down this data. Then inside of here, we actually get an object called props. And on this props, we can say props.onSubmit. And that's going to give us whatever we pass into here. So props.onSubmit is essentially our add to do function. So right here, I could change this to props.onSubmit, and this should work just fine. So now if I type something in, click add, you can see it has added it to our list. Now this is a little bit of a kind of long way of writing this. Generally what you do is you destructure this to our onSubmit property, just like this. and then you would just call on submit down here. This is going to work exactly the same. Now this is just using destructuring, which I have a video on. I'll link it in the cards and description for you. It's pretty straightforward concept, and it's a JavaScript specific concept. So this is how you pass down props. You just make sure that whatever you call the prop here, you make sure you match the exact same name up here inside of the function signature. Now the next thing I want to work on is our list right here. So I'm going to just collapse this down, copy this over, and we're going to create a new component called to-do list.jsx, because this is the next most logical thing to break up. Export a function with that name, and we're just going to make sure we return all of this content right there. So now if we just come over here, make sure I remove the list, you're going to see that the list has been removed, and we just want to render out to-do list. Now obviously this is going to give us a bunch of errors because we haven't passed in everything that we need, but at least we have the HTML here. Obviously we need to get all of our to-dos, so we're going to say to-dos just like that. And for now, I'm going to make sure that the on click for our button and the on change here for our input don't work. We're going to cover those in a little bit, because if we pass in our to-dos, that should be all that we need to make this work. So we can come back to here. We can say our to-dos is just equal to to-dos. And now if we save, you can see everything looks like it's working. It just makes sure my delete and my toggle buttons aren't quite working yet. But that's going to be relatively easy to get to work. But before I do that, I again want to break this out into another component. You notice this entire li right here, I could actually break into its own component called to-do item. So we could say to-do item.jsx, export function to-do item, just like that. And I want to copy all this code and return it from here. And we don't even need this key in here. We can actually remove that for now. And now we have our component. And here I want to pass in all the props for completed, ID, and title. So here where we have completed, change that to just completed, same thing with title. And all these places where we're using ID, I'll change those as well. So now let's go back over to our list here. And instead of returning an li, I'm going to return that to-do item. And this to-do item takes in all of the props of our to-do. So we have our ID, which is to-do.id. We have our completed, which is our to-do.completed. And we have our title, which is our to-do.title. Also, we need to give this a key, which is going to be to-do.id as well, because we're rendering this inside of an array. So if I do that, you can see if I refresh and I type in something, everything is working exactly as it did before. But one thing we can do to clean this up a little bit, you'll notice this is like ID maps directly to to-do.id, same thing with completed, same thing with title. I essentially want to pass all of the props of my to-do. Well, I can just spread out my to-do like this, and it's going to do exactly this. It's going to pass all the props of my to-do along exactly as they are. So if I do that, you can see it still works just fine like it was before. So now we're essentially on the final step. Inside my to-do item, I want to have toggle to-do and delete to-do being passed in. So I want to get my toggle to-do and my delete to-do. These functions need to get passed in. So inside of here, I want to again pass in toggle to-do, which is equal to toggle to-do, and delete to-do, which is equal to delete to-do. And I'm going to get those up here. Toggle to-do, delete to-do. There we go. So now they're being passed into the to-do list, which is passing them down to our to-do item, which is using them for these different event listeners. Then finally here, we can just make sure we pass down toggle to-do and delete to-do, just like that. And now if I save, give this a refresh, you're going to notice it should hopefully have everything hooked up. You can see that looks like it's working just fine. The last step I want to do is to actually hook up a listener so we can store everything inside of local storage. Because here, if I refresh, you're going to notice all my items persist inside of local storage. So I want to be able to persist that in local storage. And to do that, we need to use a brand new hook we've never used before called useEffect. So the useEffect hook is really interesting. It doesn't return anything, but it takes a function as its argument. And this function for our useEffect is essentially saying run this function every time the objects inside the array of our second property change. So what we want to do is every single time that our to-dos change, we want to run this code. And this code is just going to go to our local storage, and we want to set the items property to the JSON stringified version of our to-dos. So essentially, if I break this down really quickly, what's happening is we're saying useEffect says run this function right here that we pass to it every single time any of the values in this array change. So in our case, anytime our to-dos change, we call this function. And this function is just taking our to-dos and storing them inside of local storage. So this is right now storing our information in local storage, but we aren't actually getting our information from local storage. To get our information from local storage, we're going to call useState up here, but instead of passing it a default value, we're going to pass it a function. And the function version of useState works exactly the same. Whatever you return from the function is your default value. So I'm going to get the local value, which is just equal to local storage.getItem. We call this items. And if our local value is equal to null, then I'm just going to return an empty array, because that means we don't have any value yet. Otherwise, I'm going to return json.parse of our local value. So I'm just going to parse whatever is inside of our local storage and return that as our default value. So now, let's say I add an item, and I'll just say like item 2, and I refresh my page, you're noticing that all that data is persisting. If I check one of them, refresh, it stays. If I delete one, refresh, everything is staying. And again, the reason why all of this is working so magically is first, my useState is checking my local storage and getting the value if it exists. If it doesn't, it just defaults to an empty array. Then what happens is in our useEffect, we're saying every time we modify our to-dos, what I want to do is I want to run this function and I want to save the new value for my to-dos in my local storage. So every single time I add a new item to my list, I check an item, I delete an item, it's calling this function right here and updating the to-dos in my list, in my local storage. Then when I refresh, it's just pulling that data out when we call this function right here. Now, the only last thing that you need to know about hooks in React is that essentially they need to be called at the top of your function. I can't put a hook conditionally, so I can't say like if true, then run some code and put the hook inside of here. If I do this, immediately my code is going to actually break if this changes. So I can say like if todos.length is greater than 0, then run this code. So you can see if I delete these, you can see immediately we get an error. And if I actually inspect my page, go to the console, we're getting an error that essentially says you cannot render hooks conditionally. That's what we're doing here. You can't put them inside of ifs, you can't put them inside of loops, you can't put them after returns. They have to be essentially at the very top of your file, and they have to always run the same number of hooks every single time. And that's just one of the rules of hooks. If you just make sure you always put your hooks at the top of your file, you're not going to run into any of those issues at all. Another thing to consider about React components is they almost always follow a similar structure. For example, you have some hooks at the very top, and then you're going to have some type of helper functions or maybe some code that's doing some parsing of data. And then you finally have your return, which has all of your JSX. If we look at all of our components, they all follow the same thing. Hook, then some type of functions, and then JSX. We go down to here, you can see this one doesn't have any hooks or it doesn't have any functions, it just has our JSX. Same thing with this one, just has our JSX. So they almost always follow the same format. Now I know this is a ton to throw at you all at once, but hopefully at least get you started on your journey with React. And if you want to dive further into this and really make sure you understand everything that I'm talking about at full depth, I highly recommend checking out my React Simplified course. Again, if you're watching this video right when it goes live, I have a sale running that's going to be the cheapest it's ever going to be, so I highly recommend checking that out in the description down below. But if you're not quite ready for that, you can check out my free React Hooks Simplified course. It's completely free, but it's going to be a little bit more advanced than my React Simplified course, just because it's covering all of the hooks, which requires you to know the basics of React first. So I highly recommend you check out that course at the very least, and my React Simplified course, if you really want to make sure you master React, that's going to be the place to go. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.